I didn't ask him to repeat himself. When Raim Calderon said, "I want a divorce," his voice was steady, rehearsed, almost polite, like he'd practiced it in front of a mirror and finally decided today was the day to perform. We were seated in his mother's living room, one of those rooms designed more for display than comfort. Cream walls, gold accents, furniture no one was ever meant to sink into. Everything looked expensive and emotionally unavailable, which suited the Calderon family perfectly. I remember noticing the clock on the wall before I noticed my own heartbeat. It was ticking loudly, too loudly, and yet I felt strangely calm. I didn't ask why. I didn't ask when it started. I didn't ask who she was. I simply nodded once and said, "All right." That single word hit the room harder than a scream ever could. Raim frowned. "All right." "Yes," I replied. "All right." His mother, Isela Calderon, straightened immediately. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Not disappointment, not satisfaction. Suspicion. She had expected tears. She had expected resistance. She had expected me to beg. Instead, I reached for the glass of water on the table and took a slow sip. Raim leaned forward. "You're okay with this?" I looked at him then. Really looked. The man I married wasn't cruel. He was careful. Calculated. He avoided conflict by creating distance and letting other people do the damage for him. "I'm not here to argue," I said calmly. "You want a divorce. I agree." The silence that followed was heavy, uncomfortable. Isela finally spoke. "Well, that makes things easier." Her eyes never left my face. "You've prepared the papers?" I asked. Raim nodded and slid a thick envelope across the glass table. "I thought it would be better this way," he said. "Clean. Quick." I picked up the envelope but didn't open it yet. Before I continue, let me say this. If you enjoy calm, real-life stories where quiet decisions change everything, please subscribe and like this video. It helps these stories reach the right people. I turned back to them. "I'll have my lawyer look through it," I said. Isela let out a soft laugh. "That won't be necessary. These are standard." "I'm sure they are," I replied. Still, her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Neria, let's not complicate things. You've lived comfortably here. There's no need to turn this into something unpleasant." I met her gaze. "I'm not." That was the truth. I wasn't complicating anything. I was simplifying it. My name is Neria Vale. For 6 years, I was the woman people described as fortunate. Fortunate to marry into the Calderon family. Fortunate to live in a gated estate where silence was currency. Fortunate to have a husband who provided everything except loyalty. What no one ever said out loud was that I was replaceable. That belief was their first mistake. I opened the envelope slowly. Inside were neatly printed divorce papers, clipped together with a precision that told me this wasn't emotional. It was administrative. Raim had already signed. I scanned the pages calmly, even though I'd seen versions of documents like this hundreds of times before. Asset separation, property division, non-disclosure clauses. Isela watched me closely, waiting. I reached the final page and paused. "You're not going to fight this?" Raim asked, unable to hide the edge in his voice. Picked up the pen. "No," I said. And I signed. Just like that. The room shifted instantly. Raim exhaled sharply, relief washing over his face so fast it almost made me pity him. Isela's fingers tightened on the armrest of her chair. "You're signing now?" she asked. "Yes." "You don't want time to think?" "I already have." That unsettled her. Because what they didn't know, what they never bothered to learn, was that I don't make decisions quickly. I prepare quietly. I stood up after signing. Smoothing my dress like this was just another appointment. "I'll arrange to collect my personal items this week," I said. Raim hesitated. "You don't have to rush." I smiled politely. "I prefer clarity." As I walked toward the door, Isela spoke again. "You should understand," she said coolly. "This divorce means you'll no longer have access to Calderon privileges." I turned back to her. "Privileges?" I repeated softly. "Yes," she said. "Certain protections. Certain comforts." I nodded once. "I understand." What she didn't understand was that I had never relied on Calderon privileges. I relied on documentation. 3 days later, the first phone call came. I was sitting alone in the apartment I'd moved into quietly months earlier, small, minimal, and fully mine, when my phone rang. "Ms. Vale," a male voice said carefully. "This is Adrian Holt, legal counsel for Calderon Holdings." I leaned back in my chair. "Yes," I said. "I was expecting your call." There was a pause. "You were?" "Yes." Another pause. Longer. "We've discovered an issue," he said slowly. I closed my eyes briefly. "Which one?" I asked. Silence. Then cautiously, "The dormant co-founder clause attached to the marital dissolution." I smiled. "Ah," I said. "That one. They never asked me what I did for a living. They assumed. They always do. They had never asked what I did for a living. That was always the funny part. In the Calderon family, curiosity only moved in one direction, upward. They cared deeply about who controlled them, who outranked them, who threatened their standing. People beneath them were background noise. So when I married Raim, no one bothered to ask why I was so comfortable reading contracts, or why I never flinched during financial discussions, or why I asked very specific questions when the family trust was mentioned at dinner. They assumed I was organized. I was prepared. Adrian Holt cleared his throat on the phone. "Ms. Vale, this clause, it hasn't been activated in decades." "I'm aware," I said calmly. "It predates most of the current board." "Yes. And it becomes enforceable only under very specific circumstances." "Marriage," I said. "And divorce." Another pause. His voice lowered. "With respect, why wasn't this disclosed earlier?" I smiled faintly. "Because no one asked. When my grandmother died, she left me 3 things. A modest inheritance, a handwritten letter, and access. She had been a quiet woman, the kind that never raised her voice but always knew what was happening 2 steps ahead. In her letter, she told me the truth about the Calderon Empire, how it had been built, who had truly funded it, and which agreements were intentionally buried once her name stopped carrying weight. Power doesn't disappear, she wrote. Just waits for the right condition. Marriage had been one condition. Divorce was the other. By the time Adrian called again the next day, the tone had changed. "We've scheduled an emergency board review," he said. "This situation requires clarification." "I agree," I said. "You'll be present?" "No." Silence. "You're declining." "I'm unnecessary," I replied. "The documents speak clearly." That unsettled him. People like Adrian were used to confrontation. Raised voices, frantic demands, emotional negotiations. They didn't know what to do with calm certainty. Raim showed up at my apartment that evening without warning. I didn't invite him in. "You knew," he said, the moment I opened the door. "You knew something like this could happen." I leaned against the doorframe, composed. "I knew the clauses existed," I corrected. "I didn't force you to activate them." His jaw tightened. "My mother says you planned this." "No," I said quietly. "I prepared for it." "That's the same thing." "It isn't." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration finally breaking through his polished exterior. "You let me believe you'd walk away with nothing." "I walked away with exactly what I intended to," I said. He stared at me like he was seeing a stranger. "You could have warned me." I tilted my head slightly. "You wanted a clean divorce. That's not." "You wanted silence," I interrupted gently. "I honored that." His shoulders sagged. "For years," he said, "you acted like you didn't care." "I cared," I replied. "I just didn't panic." He left without another word. That was the last time he ever stood taller than me. 2 days later, the Calderon estate went quiet. No scheduled meetings. No public appearances. No confidence statements to the press. Only whispers. Accounts were temporarily restricted pending clarification. A pending acquisition was delayed indefinitely. Board members began asking questions no one wanted to answer. And still I said nothing. Around this time, if this story feels familiar, or if you've ever watched people underestimate someone because they stayed quiet, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone. Isela finally called on the 4th day. She didn't bother pretending this time. "You humiliated us," she said coldly. "I signed papers," I replied. "That's all. You knew what would happen." "I knew what could happen. You weaponized the marriage." I closed my eyes briefly, choosing my words carefully. "No," I said. "You dismissed it." She inhaled sharply. What do you want? She demanded. There it was. The question she should have asked years ago. I want what the law already recognizes, I said calmly. Nothing more. You'll dismantle everything. No, I corrected. I'm just no longer protecting it. Her voice dropped. Do you understand what this will cost my son? I opened my eyes. Yes, I said. He asked for the divorce. Silence. Then softer, almost defeated. You could stop this. I smiled faintly. I already stopped participating. The board ruling came a week later. I wasn't present. I wasn't needed. The dormant clause was valid. The co-founder rights were enforceable. Temporary authority shifted. Raim lost his executive role pending review. Isela submitted her resignation that same afternoon, citing personal reasons. The Calderon estate, once untouchable, was quietly listed. I watched the headlines like weather reports. Informative. Distant. People often think revenge looks like rage. Doesn't. It looks like patience finally reaching maturity. The lawyer called me once more, voice carefully respectful now. Ms. Vale, Adrian said. The board would like to discuss long-term restructuring. I'm unavailable, I replied. You're declining involvement? Yes. But this is your leverage. I smiled. No, I said. This is my closure. That night I poured myself a glass of wine and stood by the window of my apartment, watching the city lights flicker on one by one. For the first time in years everything was quiet. Not the tense silence of endurance. The peaceful kind. The kind that comes when you no longer have to prove anything. The strange thing about silence is that once you choose it, people start filling it with their own fear. I didn't make public statements. I didn't correct rumors. I didn't post explanations. And that unsettled them far more than any accusation ever could. Within 2 weeks, people who had never learned my name suddenly remembered it. Former board members reached out, just to check in. Distant relatives asked if I was holding up well. Acquaintances I hadn't heard from in years suddenly wanted lunch. I declined all of it. Not out of bitterness. Out of clarity. Raim sent a message late one evening. Can we talk? I stared at the screen for a long moment before replying. About what? The typing bubble appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. About us. There was no anger in me when I read that. Only a dull understanding. There is no us, I typed. You signed that away. Several minutes passed before his response came. I didn't know it would cost this much. I exhaled slowly. That, more than anything else, told me I'd made the right decision. The next time we spoke in person was not planned. I ran into him outside a legal office downtown of all places. He looked different. Not dramatic. Not ruined. Just smaller. His posture was less certain. His confidence is no longer automatic. Neria, he said quietly. I nodded. Raim. He hesitated, then gestured toward a nearby cafe. Do you have a minute? I considered it, then nodded once. We sat across from each other in silence for a while. He finally spoke first. I never thought you'd do this. I didn't do anything, I replied. I agreed. You always do that, he said. Make it sound simple. Because it is. He looked at me then. Really looked like he was searching for something familiar. When did you change? He asked. I shook my head. I didn't. That was the part he still didn't understand. I had always been this way. My mother thinks you planned everything from the start, he said quietly. I planned for outcomes, I replied. Not betrayals. He flinched slightly. I didn't mean for it to happen like this. I know, I said. That's what makes it worse. He looked down at his hands. Do you hate me? I thought about it. No, I said truthfully. I just stopped protecting you. That seemed to hurt him more than anger ever could. The truth is, love doesn't disappear all at once. It thins. It erodes. Turns into understanding. And sometimes understanding is what finally sets you free. A month later, the Calderon name officially stepped down from executive control. No scandal. No dramatic headlines. Just a quiet transition that insiders would remember for years. I received a final letter from the board. They thanked me for my discretion. I didn't reply. I didn't need their gratitude. I had my peace. If you've stayed with me this far, thank you. Stories like this aren't about shouting or revenge. They're about quiet decisions that change everything. If you're finding meaning in this story, subscribing helps make sure you don't miss the next one. Life after the divorce was not dramatic. It was steady. I reorganized my days, redefined my routines, reclaimed parts of myself I'd set aside to make room for someone else's comfort. The world didn't end. It expanded. One afternoon, I visited my grandmother's old house. It had been sold years ago, but the new owners had kept much of it intact. I walked through the room slowly, memories echoing softly in corners. In her old study, I paused by the window and remembered her words. Silence isn't weakness. It's a strategy. She had never raised her voice. She had never needed to. The final call from Isella came unexpectedly. Her voice was tired, stripped of authority. I won't pretend to understand you, she said. But I suppose I underestimated you. Yes, I replied gently. You did. Another pause. I hope it was worth it. I smiled softly. It wasn't about worth, I said. It was about balance. She hung up without another word. And that was the end of that chapter. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I simply moved forward. Because the most powerful thing you can do after someone underestimates you is live well. Quietly, completely, and on your own terms. People assume the hardest part of divorce is the aftermath. The paperwork. The silence. The rebuilding. For me, the hardest part was realizing how much of myself I had been shrinking to make other people comfortable. Once that awareness settles in, you don't unsee it. Months passed quietly. The noise faded. The Calderon name still existed, of course, but without the authority it once carried. Raim took a consulting role overseas. Isella disappeared from public life entirely. No dramatic downfall. Just a slow erosion of relevance. That's how most empires actually end. I was asked once during a casual dinner with a colleague whether I regretted being so calm through everything. She meant it kindly. I smiled and said, no. Calm gave me time. Time to read. Time to prepare. Time to decide what I would and would not accept ever again. People think strength looks loud. Doesn't. Strength looks like knowing when not to speak. One evening, nearly a year after the divorce, I received an envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. A handwritten note. Neria, I finally understand what you meant when you said you stopped protecting me. I wish I had listened sooner. R. I folded the note carefully and placed it back in the envelope. I didn't respond. Some realizations come too late to change outcomes, but right on time to teach lessons. Life didn't magically become perfect after that. But it became honest. I chose work that challenged me. People who respected my silence. Spaces where I didn't have to explain myself. Peace I learned isn't dramatic. It's consistent. I often think back to that moment in Isella's living room. The pen in my hand, the eyes on me, the expectation that I would finally break. Instead, I agreed. Not because I was weak, but because I knew something they didn't. That silence isn't surrender. It's leverage. If you're listening to this and you're in a situation where people assume you're calm means you've already lost, remember this. You don't owe anyone your panic. You don't owe anyone your strategy. And you certainly don't owe anyone a warning. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let people believe they've won. And then move on. If you stayed until the end, thank you for listening. Stories like this are uploaded here regularly. Stories about quiet strength, clarity, and consequences. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And I'll see you in the next story.